World War II ended, with parades, ruined cities, and a new kind of fear. The United States and the Soviet Union were allies on paper, but they stared at the future with different nightmares. One side feared another depression and a return of dictators. The other feared invasion ever happening again. And hovering above both was a terrifying invention, the bomb, proof that the next war could be the last. This is how the Cold War begins, not with a declaration, but with suspicion becoming a habit. In 1945, Europe was physically broken and emotionally exhausted. Families measured life in ration lines, missing roofs, and trains that didn't run. Rebuilding wasn't only about bricks, it was about rules, police, and who got to decide tomorrow. When systems collapse, the first battle is over supply and order. Whoever controls that recovery controls the future. At Yalta, leaders tried to design peace while the war still roared. They spoke about elections and freedom, but also about borders and security buffers. Each promise meant something different to each signer. Agreements made under pressure can be flexible or dangerously vague. Vagueness is where suspicion grows. At Potsdam, the mood had shifted from partnership to bargaining. The war was ending, and the bill was due. Who would control Germany, and on what terms? Every checkpoint and rail line suddenly looked like a future border. When trust falls, even logistics becomes political. A divided Germany was becoming a divided world in miniature. The atomic bomb ended the war in the Pacific and changed diplomacy everywhere. It promised safety through power, but it also announced a new race. If one side could destroy a city in seconds, the other side had to catch up, or feel defenseless. Weapons don't just sit in warehouses. They reshape negotiations. From now on, fear had a timer. The United Nations was built on a desperate idea. Rules might prevent another catastrophe. Delegates wanted cooperation, but great powers still guarded their interests. A veto could stop a war, or freeze solutions. Institutions can slow chaos, but they can't erase rivalry. Still, for a moment, people believed the world could be managed. Germany was split into zones, each with different administrators and different priorities. Demilitarization, denazification, and survival happened alongside political competition. In the West, recovery leaned toward markets and elections. In the East, toward control and security. For civilians, ideology felt like who controlled the police station and the food depot. Germany became the laboratory of mistrust. The Soviet Union demanded reparations because it had paid an enormous price in blood and destruction. Factories, rail equipment, and resources became bargaining chips. To Western eyes, dismantling looked like punishment that would breed desperation again. To Soviet eyes, it looked like insurance against the next invasion. Same action, opposite meaning, perfect fuel for conflict. While diplomats argued, radios began to frame the story. Every speech was a signal to allies, rivals, and nervous publics. Propaganda isn't only lies, it's selection. Which facts you shout and which you whisper. A world with microphones becomes a world of competing realities. The Cold War was also a war over meaning. By the end of 1945, nobody had declared a new conflict. But the incentives had shifted. Security required influence, and influence required rules you controlled. Germany's future, the bomb, and economic survival all pulled the Allies apart. Once institutions, borders, and narratives harden, compromise gets harder every month. The Cold War's first walls were invisible, made of fear and memory. To the Soviet leadership, Eastern Europe was a shield, space that could absorb any future attack. That logic pushed for friendly governments, loyal police, and controlled borders. To many locals, it felt like liberation turning into supervision. When a great power seeks safety, smaller nations often pay the cost. The buffer became the first front line. Elections happened, but power often flowed through pressure. Who could campaign? Who could speak? Who could organize? When fear enters politics, ballots become theater. Control can be quieter than tanks, papers, arrests, and friendly coalitions. The West watched these changes and concluded a pattern was forming. Patterns are how strategy is born. Poland was a warning sign because it sat at the intersection of promises and security. Wartime talks had hinted at freedom and self-determination, but realities on the ground were harsher. When leaders feel existential fear, they interpret promises as optional. When outsiders see broken promises, they interpret them as intentional expansion. Trust breaks faster than it can be repaired. In 1946, Churchill warned that an Iron Curtain had fallen across Europe. The phrase mattered because it named what many suspected but couldn't yet measure. Naming a conflict makes people choose sides sooner. It also hardens identities. Us and them become permanent categories. Words can build walls before concrete does. The Soviet Union had been invaded repeatedly in modern history, and the scars were fresh. From that view, harsh control looked like rational prevention. The problem is that prevention for one side feels like domination to the other. Security dilemmas are traps. Both sides take steps to feel safe and end up less safe. The Cold War is a security dilemma with cities at stake. In Washington and London, Eastern Europe began to look closed, a region turning away from open politics and open markets. Diplomats and analysts asked whether this was temporary chaos or deliberate expansion. If it was deliberate, waiting could be dangerous. The question wasn't only moral, it was strategic. Where would it stop? Containment thinking began to take shape. Germany was still hungry, still ruined, and still central. Allies argued about rebuilding because rebuilding could also create power. If Germany recovered under one side's rules, that side gained an engine for influence. Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, became the strangest symbol, one city with 4 rulers. Symbols are magnets for crisis. Propaganda filled the airwaves because the battlefield was belief. Each side promised peace while warning about the other's plans. The loudest messages often hid the same quiet truth. Neither trusted the other. When public narratives harden, leaders lose room to compromise without looking weak. Crowds become part of the strategy. Intelligence work expanded because guessing wrong could be catastrophic. Secrets about weapons, plans, and politics became priceless. Espionage thrives when trust collapses. Information becomes the only bridge left. But bridges made of secrecy are fragile. They encourage worst-case thinking. In a nuclear age, worst-case thinking is lethal. By late 1946, Europe's political map was tilting into 2 clusters. The East was tightening control. The West was talking about rebuilding and collective defense. Each step looked defensive to the side taking it, and threatening to the side watching it. That mutual misunderstanding became a machine. And machines keep running unless someone pulls the plug. From Moscow, George Kennan sent a long message explaining Soviet behavior as driven by insecurity and ideology. He argued the Soviet system would push outward when it could and retreat when it met firm resistance. It wasn't a call for war, it was a call for patience and strength. A good strategy names the game you're playing. Containment was the name. Containment turned fear into a plan. Focus on key regions, support stability, and avoid direct war. It treated the Cold War like a slow contest of systems, not a single battle. That framing changed budgets, alliances, and speeches. Once policy becomes a map, leaders start navigating by it, even when reality is messy. Maps can guide, but they can also trap. In Greece, civil conflict and instability looked like an opening for influence. To Americans, it was a test. If chaos spreads, does the Soviet sphere grow without firing a shot? To locals, it was survival and exhaustion after occupation and war. Great powers often interpret local pain as a global signal. Signals drive policy. Control of sea routes and straits can be as powerful as armies. Pressure on Turkey raised alarms because it hinted at control over access between seas. For the Soviets, it was strategic security. For the West, it looked like expansion to warm water influence. Geography turns diplomacy into a tug of war. In the Cold War, maps were weapons. In 1947, Truman announced support for free peoples resisting coercion. It was a promise with a global horizon.
The U.S. was stepping into a long commitment. Promises deter rivals, but they also create obligations you must now defend. This was the Cold War becoming official in America's vocabulary. From here on, retreat would look like defeat.
Post-war economies were fragile. Broken factories, broken trade, and fragile trust. When people are hungry, extreme politics gains oxygen. American leaders began to see economic aid as anti-entropy, energy that prevents collapse. This wasn't charity alone, it was strategy. Stability became a form of defense. The Soviet narrative framed Western aid as a mask for control. Radio and newspapers warned about capitalist encirclement and hidden strings. Each side believed it was stopping domination, while the other side believed it was being dominated. Propaganda didn't create the conflict, but it made it easier to sustain. A divided story makes a divided world. In the East, control often moved through institutions, party offices, security services, and paperwork. These tools can feel mundane, which is why they're powerful. A system of surveillance doesn't need constant violence. It needs constant certainty that it could act. Fear becomes self-enforcement. That's how a sphere becomes stable.
Western Europe rebuilt through coalitions, elections, and painful compromises.
Recovery required trade restarting, currency stabilizing, and trust returning. The question was whether democracies could deliver speed without becoming authoritarian. If they succeeded, they would be a living argument against Soviet-style control. Cold War competition was also a competition of performance. By the end of 1947, the rivalry had a plan, a vocabulary, and a growing set of commitments. Containment shaped how the U.S. interpreted crises, and Soviet leaders interpreted containment as encirclement. When both sides adopt frameworks that assume the worst, every event looks like proof. Proof leads to faster decisions and fewer second chances. The stage was set for a test that couldn't be ignored. Marshall's plan was simple in shape and huge in impact. Rebuild Europe's economic engine. A functioning economy reduces desperation, and desperation is the easiest door for extremists. But aid also builds alignment. You trade with the hand that feeds your factories. Money can be a weapon that doesn't look like one. That is why the Marshall Plan terrified Moscow. The first shipments mattered as much psychologically as materially. Empty shelves turning full creates belief in the future. Belief lowers the appeal of radical promises and raises trust in institutions. Cold War strategy here was quiet. Feed people, restart trade, stabilize money. The sound of cranes became a political signal. Aid was never neutral. Countries debated sovereignty, accept assistance and align with Western rules, or refuse and risk collapse. Leaders feared being bought, but also feared being left behind. In a divided world, refusing help can be a political statement, one that has costs. This is how economics becomes geopolitics. The Soviet Union rejected the Marshall Plan and pressured Eastern states to do the same. Allowing Western money into the Soviet sphere looked like letting an enemy into your supply chain. So the curtain hardened. Trade routes redirected, policies standardized, choices narrowed. A bloc is a system that reduces options. Reduced options reduce neutrality. Coordination isn't only military, it's narrative. Common Form helped align communist parties and messaging across borders. Unified messaging makes a bloc feel coherent and disciplined. But coherence often requires suppressing disagreement. A machine runs smoother when you remove the friction of debate. In Western Europe, elections were also contests of future alignment. Parties argued over work, food, and independence, while both blocs watched closely. When great powers treat elections as referendums on global order, stakes rise. High stakes make societies fragile. Fear becomes a campaign tool. Czechoslovakia's 1948 crisis shocked many observers because it looked like a door slamming shut. Political pressure and power maneuvers pushed the country firmly into the Soviet orbit. The lesson the West learned was brutal. The curtain was not just a metaphor. When one dramatic event confirms a fear, policies harden overnight. Hard policies then provoke hard counter-policies. As events confirmed worst-case expectations, decision cycles shortened.
Leaders began to think in chains. If this falls, then that is next. Domino logic can be useful, but it can also exaggerate threats. Either way, it pushes governments toward commitments they cannot easily reverse. That is how a rivalry becomes durable. Western zones moved toward currency reform and economic rebuilding. To the Soviet side, that looked like creating a stronger rival state inside a shared space. Berlin, split but connected, was the pressure point where these policies collided. In systems terms, Berlin was a narrow pipe. Block the pipe, control the flow. The next crisis would be about that pipe. By mid-1948, Europe's recovery was separating along policy lines. Aid, trade, and institutions pulled westward. Control and security systems pulled eastward. The curtain was becoming a supply chain boundary. Now a single city would test whether pressure could force surrender without war. Berlin was about to become the world's most watched warehouse. West Berlin was a Western enclave deep inside the Soviet zone. Its survival depended on corridors, roads, rails, and air routes that could be squeezed. That made the city a perfect pressure test. If the West abandoned Berlin, it would signal weakness. If it fought, it risked the war everyone feared. When the West introduced a new currency in its zones, it aimed to restart a functioning economy. To Moscow, it looked like building a separate German state without consent. In a brittle system, technical reforms can trigger political explosions. Because money is trust, and trust is power. Berlin was where that trust would be tested. In 1948, Soviet authorities blocked land access to West Berlin. No trucks, no trains, no coal. Pressure applied through logistics. This was conflict without gunfire, a siege made of paperwork and barriers. For civilians, it meant cold apartments and empty shelves. For leaders, it meant a decision under a spotlight. The Western response was audacious. Supply a city by air. It sounded impossible, because cities eat a lot, especially in winter. But logistics can defeat pressure if routines are relentless. The airlift would be a factory of flights, measured in minutes and tons. In the Cold War, spreadsheets could be weapons. Day and night, planes landed, unloaded, and took off again. Coal, flour, medicine, small icons of survival. The real miracle was repetition. Thousands of ordinary flights made an extraordinary bridge. When systems work, they look boring from the outside. For Berliners, that boring rhythm sounded like hope. Winter raised the stakes because cold is non-negotiable. Coal shipments became the heartbeat of the airlift. The city adapted, rationing, shared warmth, and patience. A blockade tries to make a population blame its protectors. The airlift tried to make them believe in endurance. The blockade was meant to force negotiation on Soviet terms, but backing down would damage Western credibility far beyond Berlin. Credibility is an invisible currency. Once spent, hard to regain. Both sides watched for signs of weakness like hawks watching a field. That mutual watching kept the crisis alive. Some pilots dropped small sweets for children, tiny gestures that became giant symbols. Symbols matter because they travel faster than cargo manifests. Airlift success wasn't only supply, it was narrative. We won't abandon you. In Cold War logic, hearts were strategic terrain. Berlin became a story as much as a city. In 1949, the blockade was lifted, but the lesson remained. Pressure had failed to force surrender, and logistics had proved a new kind of strength. Yet the crisis deepened the split. Cooperation felt impossible now. Berlin survived, but trust did not. A victory can still move the world closer to long-term conflict. Berlin showed that the Cold War could be fought through systems, supply, credibility, and propaganda. It also convinced both blocs that the other would not easily yield. That realization pushed leaders toward formal alliances and stronger military planning. A temporary crisis created permanent architecture. The world was now building its new walls on purpose. After Berlin, Western states moved toward a formal defense pact, NATO. An alliance is a promise made ahead of time, so you don't have to improvise during panic. It pools fear into shared planning. But to the other side,
Pooled fear looks like encirclement. Alliances can deter wars and still deepen division.
The Soviet response wasn't calm acceptance, it was consolidation.
If the West was organizing, the East had to organize harder. Borders became stricter, economies more coordinated, dissent more dangerous. A bloc is stability through control. Control reduces surprises and increases resentment. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. The monopoly ended, and the world entered a new equilibrium of fear. Now both sides had the power to destroy, and therefore the incentive to avoid direct war. Deterrence is a strange logic. Peace built on terror. The nuclear shadow fell across every future decision.
Nuclear weapons changed the meaning of strength.
Winning a war could mean losing everything. So leaders began to measure risk like engineers.
Thresholds, red lines, and escalation ladders.
That made proxy conflict more attractive, fighting indirectly to avoid the apocalypse. The system was steering away from one danger toward another.
When weapons are catastrophic, information becomes priceless.
Spies hunted secrets about bombs, aircraft, and intentions. Secrecy created paranoia, and paranoia created bigger intelligence machines.
It's a feedback loop. Mistrust produces spying. Spying produces more mistrust.
Cold War engines ran on hidden fuel.
Air power became central because it moved faster than borders could react.
The airlift proved aircraft could decide political outcomes without firing a shot. Now both sides invested in bombers, interceptors, and early jets. Technology accelerated the pace of fear. Speed itself became threatening. The propaganda war matured into institutions. Radio services, cultural messaging, and carefully chosen images of the good life. Each side tried to prove its system delivered security and dignity. The audience wasn't only citizens, it was undecided countries watching from the outside. Selling your system is easier than invading with it. So stories became strategic assets. In 1949, Germany's division hardened into two states, one in the west, one in the east. What began as occupation management became permanent architecture. For families, it meant paperwork, checkpoints, and relatives suddenly abroad without moving. When borders become normal, they shape identity. Germany was now the Cold War's mirror.
Both sides prepared for a war they claimed they didn't want. That's the tragedy of security dilemmas.
Planning looks like aggression to your rival, so each plan triggers a counterplan. Over time, preparation becomes its own reason to stay tense, because standing down feels risky. The Cold War stabilized into armed caution.
By late 1949, the world had two armed blocs and two nuclear powers.
That balance reduced the chance of direct invasion, but increased the importance of influence, proxies, and internal control. The contest was now global and long. A world divided by fear doesn't relax, it reorganizes. The Cold War had found its stable shape.
In 1949, China's revolution reshaped the global balance.
To Americans, it looked like communism spreading. To many Chinese, it looked like the end of civil war and humiliation. One event carried multiple truths, but great powers often pick the interpretation that fits their fears. With China, the Cold War stopped being mainly European. It became planetary. Across Asia and Africa, empires weakened and independence movements surged. New nations needed roads, schools, and security, and both blocs offered models and support. The Cold War turned development into a battleground of influence. Neutrality was possible, but it was expensive. You had to resist pressure from both sides. The world's middle became the prize.
Money, engineers, and advisors traveled with strategic purpose.
Helping a country rebuild could also help align its future votes and alliances. Infrastructure became persuasive. Power plants, ports, and wheat shipments. Influence often arrives in crates before it arrives in treaties. That is why economics stayed central.
With nuclear weapons looming, direct war between superpowers was terrifying.
So competition shifted into proxy logic. Support allies, fund factions, advise armies. Proxy wars are safer for the sponsors, but brutal for the places where they happen. Systems of fear export risk outward. the Cold War's geography expanded.
Korea was divided after the war,
And the division hardened into rival governments. A line on a map can become a line in people's lives. Families, markets, and politics split. Both blocs saw Korea as a test of credibility and momentum. Local tensions became global signals again. The fuse was visible even before it lit.
Berlin taught strategists that logistics can win political contests.
Airfields, ports, and supply chains became tools of persuasion and survival. Planning shifted toward how do we sustain allies under pressure. Sustaining allies is a system: money, transport, and belief. Belief is the hardest cargo to deliver.
Even movies, music, and sports became part of the competition.
Each side advertised modernity and moral superiority. Ordinary people were asked to live inside a story. Our way is safer, fairer, brighter. When culture becomes strategic, everyday life becomes political. A divided world divides imagination too. Most days in the early Cold War were not crises. They were routines under uncertainty, cues, school, work, and quiet conversations about what might happen. The nuclear shadow did not explode. It lingered like weather. Living with fear changes how societies behave. More conformity, more suspicion, more planning. The Cold War settled into daily life.
Some leaders tried to chart a third path.
Cooperate with both sides, belong fully to neither. Neutrality required bargaining skill and internal unity. But pressure is constant. Loans, weapons offers, trade deals, and threats. In a polarized system, the center is unstable. Still, the attempt mattered because it proved the world was not only two voices.
By 1950, the Cold War was no longer a European argument.
It was a global system of alliances, aid, intelligence, and fear. Local conflicts were interpreted through superpower lenses, which made them harder to solve locally. The rivalry had become a world framework, and frameworks shape everything that follows.
The Cold War's first years built a mental map of enemies and allies. Once people learn to see the world in two colors,
nuance becomes suspicious. Governments then reward certainty and punish doubt. That social change is part of the Cold War system, not just a side effect. Division becomes self-reinforcing.
Institutions turned temporary choices into durable commitments.
Membership meant shared planning, shared standards, and shared enemies. That can prevent sudden panic, but it also makes switching sides nearly impossible. When exits vanish, tension becomes permanent. The Cold War was an architecture of locked doors.
Borders aren't just lines, they are technologies.
Checkpoints, stamps, permits, and surveillance make separation real. When a border controls movement, it controls information and family ties too. Systems of control don't need constant force, they need constant friction. Friction changes lives.
One side builds a weapon, the other side answers, and both claim they are only responding.
That loop creates momentum. Budgets, scientists, factories, and secret programs. Even if leaders want to slow down, institutions and fear push forward. Technology becomes policy in metal form. The shadow grows because the loop spins.
The West sold safety through prosperity and open markets.
The East sold safety through control and strategic depth. Both definitions emerge from real experiences and real fears. But when definitions clash, cooperation becomes a moral argument, not a technical one. Moral arguments are the hardest to compromise on.
Berlin remained a warning light on the Cold War dashboard.
Its survival required constant attention. Money, troops, and political will. A city can become a symbol so powerful that leaders can't ignore it without losing face. Face becomes policy, and policy becomes risk. That's how symbols keep systems tense.
Most people didn't choose the Cold War, but they learned to live inside it. They adapted to shortages, censorship, rumors, and the constant question of who to trust. Adaptation is a kind of survival intelligence. But adaptation can also normalize fear.
Normal fear is the Cold War's quiet victory.
The early Cold War shows a classic systems pattern.
Security dilemmas create blocks. Each side's defensive steps look offensive to the other side. That perception drives countersteps, which harden institutions, which reduce exits. Reduced exits increase fear, and fear increases the need for defense. The loop closes and keeps spinning. History was not automatic. Different choices at key moments, Germany's future, aid rules, and communication, might have reduced fear or slowed division. But choices happened inside constraints. Trauma, ruins, and the bomb. Systems limit options even for powerful leaders. Understanding constraints is how we learn from the past. By 1949, the world was divided into rival systems that each believed it was defending peace. Berlin proved logistics could beat pressure. NATO proved alliances could formalize fear. And the Soviet bomb proved the shadow was shared. The Cold War began because insecurity became structure, and structure became habit. The next decades would be shaped by this machine of fear, pride, and competition, and ordinary families would live under it every day.